House Velaryon of Driftmark is without question the most important non-Targaryen house on Team Black's side, and honestly, the entire reason Rhaenyra's faction had any chance of winning in the first place. Their sigil shows a silver seahorse on a sea-green field, and they've flown those colors from the island of Driftmark in Blackwater Bay for centuries. The Velaryons are one of the few Velaryon noble families that survived the doom of Valyria, making them ancient by any standard and culturally almost indistinguishable from the Targaryens themselves during the height of their power. Lord Corlys Velaryon, known across the world as the Sea Snake, was arguably the most accomplished man in all of Westeros during this era. He made 9 great voyages across seas that most sailors never dared attempt, built House Velaryon into the wealthiest family in the Seven Kingdoms, accumulated enough gold to challenge the Iron Throne itself, and commanded a fleet so massive that it gave Team Black complete naval dominance from the very first day of the war. When people talk about what Team Black brought militarily, the Velaryon fleet has to be mentioned before anything else. The personal connection between the Velaryons and Team Black ran even deeper than political alliance. Corlys Velaryon was married to Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, Rhaenyra's cousin, and one of the most powerful dragon riders alive. More critically, Rhaenyra herself had children with Corlys' son, Laenor Velaryon, meaning the boys Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey were Velaryon grandchildren, regardless of the whispered questions about their true parentage. The fates of House Velaryon and House Targaryen were bound together through blood, marriage, and years of shared political investment. What Corlys brought operationally to Team Black was staggering. The Velaryon fleet controlled the waters around King's Landing and the approaches to Blackwater Bay, meaning Team Green couldn't easily receive supplies or reinforcements by sea. Driftmark's position between the capital and the open ocean gave Team Black a stranglehold on naval trade that created constant pressure on Aegon's court. The wealth of House Velaryon also funded much of Team Black's war effort at a time when Rhaenyra needed resources to pay armies and keep allies loyal. The cost the Velaryons paid for this loyalty was devastating. Laenor Velaryon had been murdered years before the war even began. Laena Velaryon, Corlys' daughter and another dragon rider, died in childbirth. Then during the war itself, young Lucerys Velaryon was killed above the sea at Storm's End when Aemon Targaryen and his dragon Vhagar hunted him down, an event that transformed what might have been a political struggle into an all-out bloody war. Rhaenys Targaryen died heroically in the Battle of the Gullet, choosing to stand and fight rather than flee when her position was overwhelmed. Corlys survived the war but barely, and House Velaryon never again reached the heights of wealth and influence they commanded when the Sea Snake was in his prime. House Stark of Winterfell declared for Team Black early in the conflict and committed to that position with the steadfast stubbornness that everyone has come to expect from the North. Their sigil is the Grey Direwolf on a white field, and they've ruled from Winterfell as kings in the North for thousands of years before bending the knee to Aegon the Conqueror. By the time of the dance, the Starks had already been the dominant force in the North for so long that their rule felt like a natural law rather than a political arrangement. The Lord of Winterfell during the dance was Cregan Stark, a man who would end up playing one of the most dramatic roles in the entire conflict, despite arriving late to most of the fighting. Cregan had negotiated with Jacaerys Velaryon early in the war, receiving the young prince at Winterfell and pledging northern support for Team Black's cause. The terms of this agreement became known as the Pact of Ice and Fire, which promised a marriage alliance between the Starks and the Targaryens, binding their futures together in a way that would echo for generations. The North's support for Rhaenyra was partly ideological and partly practical. The North respected oaths and legitimate succession above almost everything else in politics. Viserys I has spent his entire reign insisting Rhaenyra was his heir and had made his lords swear oaths to that effect. When Aegon II was placed on the throne in direct violation of those oaths, the Starks viewed it as a betrayal of everything a lord was supposed to stand for. The North had bent the knee to Targaryens because of agreements and sworn oaths, and those oaths pointed clearly to Rhaenyra. The Northern army never actually arrived in time to fight most of the major battles of the dance. The distances involved in moving tens of thousands of men from beyond the Neck down to the contested Riverlands and the capital were simply too great. But Cregan Stark's army did eventually march south, and they arrived at King's Landing right at the moment the war was effectively ending, following the deaths of most of the major Targaryen dragon riders on both sides. What followed is known as the Hour of the Wolf, a brief period where Cregan Stark effectively controlled King's Landing and imposed his own justice on the city. He arrested dozens of lords and servants he viewed as traitors, held trials at a speed that left everyone's head spinning, and executed those he found guilty with northern directness. He served as Hand of the King for a grand total of 18 days before returning home, having satisfied himself that justice had been done and that the North's honor was intact. The Stark decision to back Team Black was ultimately vindicated by history. Their loyalty to legitimate succession kept them in good standing with whoever ended up ruling afterward. And Cregan's conduct during the Hour of the Wolf earned him a reputation for stern honor that served House Stark's image for generations. The North survived the dance relatively intact compared to the devastation that ravaged the Riverlands and the Crownlands, and their commitment to lawful succession became one of the defining characteristics that separated Northern culture from the political scheming of the South. House Arryn of the Eyrie is one of the oldest Andal families in Westeros, rulers of the Vale of Arryn from their impregnable mountain stronghold for thousands of years. Their sigil shows a white moon and falcon on a sky-blue field, representing the eagle-like terrain of their home and the martial prowess that Andal knights brought when they first conquered the Vale. The Eyrie sits so high in the mountains of the moon that attacking it directly is effectively impossible, giving House Arryn a security that most houses can only dream about. Lady Jane Arryn ruled the Vale during the Dance of the Dragons, and she was one of Rhaenyra's earliest and most consistent supporters. Her decision to declare for Team Black was driven by both personal loyalty and practical politics. Jane Arryn was a woman ruling in her own right, which was unusual enough in Westeros to create automatic solidarity with another woman fighting for her right to rule. If the principle that women couldn't inherit was allowed to stand in Rhaenyra's case, it potentially threatened Jane Arryn's own position in the Vale. The Vale's military contribution to Team Black was significant, but also constrained by geography. Moving large armies out of the Vale meant funneling them through the Bloody Gate, which is a natural choke point that makes mass military deployment slow and complicated. The Arryn forces that did join the fighting contributed meaningfully to several engagements in the Riverlands and provided another pressure point on Aegon's supporters. But perhaps, more importantly, the Vale represented a safe haven and potential resupply base for Team Black that Team Green could never realistically threaten. The financial resources of House Arryn also mattered. The Vale was wealthy and had stayed largely out of previous conflicts, meaning they had resources intact that other regions had depleted through decades of war and taxation. Jane Arryn's support meant access to that intact treasury and to the Vale's reputation for producing exceptional knights whose combat skills were shaped by the harsh mountain environment. What's also worth noting is what the Vale's support meant symbolically. By the time of the dance, House Arryn was one of the most prestigious families in the Southern Kingdoms. Their castle was legendary. Their military reputation was excellent. Their commitment to Team Black told other wavering lords that this wasn't just a fringe rebellion by Rhaenyra's personal friends. This was a faction with a backing of ancient and respectable houses that represented the old nobility of Westeros. Jane Arryn's signature on Team Black's cause gave a legitimacy that purely military arguments couldn't provide. Lady Jane survived the dance and continued ruling the Vale for years afterward. The Arryn commitment to Rhaenyra's cause cost them relatively less than some other Team Black houses, partly because of their geographic position, and partly because of how the war ultimately resolved. The Eyrie's impregnability meant no one seriously tried to bring the war to their doorstep, and their military contributions were real, but didn't expose them to the catastrophic losses that broke other houses during the conflict. House Tully of Riverrun has controlled the Riverlands from their seat at the confluence of the Red Fork and Tumblestone rivers for centuries. Their sigil displays a silver trout leaping on a field of red and blue, symbolizing the rivers that define their territory and their livelihood. The Riverlands are arguably the most fought-over region in all of Westeros because they sit at the geographic center of the continent, making them the natural battlefield for any conflict between the North and the South. Whoever holds the Riverlands holds the middle of Westeros, and whoever holds the middle has a massive strategic advantage. House Tully's declaration for Team Black was critically important because it handed Rhaenyra's faction control over that central territory. The Tully decision wasn't made lightly, because the Riverlands are exposed to attack from almost every direction. And the lord who throws his house into a civil war on the wrong side can expect his castles to be burned and his people to suffer regardless of eventual outcomes. Lord Grover Tully was actually an old man who personally favored Team Green, but his grandson Elmo Tully effectively led the family's political and military commitment to Rhaenyra's cause. This generational split within the Tully family reflects how complex the politics of Team Black versus Team Green actually were at the house level. Individual family members often disagreed about which faction to support, and the choices made were sometimes driven by personal relationships and local politics rather than grand ideological commitments. The Tullys had feudal bonds to other Riverlands lords, who themselves were split in their loyalties, making the Riverlands one of the most contested and chaotic regions of the entire war. The Riverlands paid an enormous price for being at the center of the conflict. Armies marching north and south had to pass through or fight through Tully territory. Castles changed hands multiple times. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and the common people of the Riverlands suffered devastation that would take generations to repair. House Tully's position at River Run was defensible enough that it didn't fall to their enemies, but the surrounding region was ravaged in ways that dramatically reduced Tully power and wealth for years after the war ended. What House Tully provided strategically was crucial beyond just the territory itself. Control of the Riverlands meant control of the road networks connecting the north to the south, the highways of commerce and military movement that any faction needed to operate effectively across the full width of Westeros. Team Black's ability to move forces, supplies, and communications through the center of the continent depended heavily on Tully's support keeping those roads and fords accessible. The aftermath of the dance left House Tully diminished, but intact. They had backed the ultimately victorious faction, which protected them from the worst political consequences. But the physical damage to their lands and the deaths of so many fighting men meant they emerged from the war weaker than they entered it. The Riverlands wouldn't fully recover for a long time, and Tully's influence over their bannermen was strained by the years of conflicting loyalties and shared devastation. House Blackwood of Raventray Hall is one of the oldest surviving First Men houses in all of Westeros, a family that traces its lineage back to before the Andal invasion and proudly still keeps the old gods of the Weirwoods. Their sigil shows a flock of black ravens surrounding a dead weirwood tree on a scarlet field, a grim symbol that perfectly captures both their ancient roots and the blood-soaked history of the Riverlands. Unlike many southern houses that converted to the faith of the Seven generations ago, the Blackwoods remained culturally tied to the North in spirit, if not in geography. During the Dance of the Dragons, House Blackwood declared firmly and immediately for Team Black. Their loyalty was not surprising. The Blackwoods had long-standing tension and rivalry with House Bracken, who would back Team Green, and in the Riverlands especially, local rivalries often mattered as much as royal politics. When the Tullys leaned toward Rhaenyra's cause, and the Riverlands fractured into chaos, the Blackwoods positioned themselves clearly on the side of Rhaenyra and her sons, aligning both with their liege lords and with their own calculation of where legitimacy lay. What made House Blackwood particularly important wasn't sheer size or wealth, but ferocity. The Blackwoods were known for producing exceptionally capable warriors, hardened by centuries of border skirmishes with their Bracken rivals. Young Blackwood knights distinguished themselves repeatedly during the war, especially in the brutal fighting that consumed the Riverlands. One of the most famous was Benjicode Blackwood, known as Bloody Ben, who was still a boy when the war began, but commanded troops with an intensity and discipline far beyond his years. The Riverlands were arguably the bloodiest theater of the entire dance. Armies marched back and forth across Tully lands, castles were besieged and burned, and loyalties shifted constantly. In that chaos, the Blackwoods remained consistently aligned with Team Black, even as the conflict dragged on and the cost mounted. Their forces fought in major engagements against both Green armies and rival river lords, helping prevent Team Green from ever fully consolidating control over the central continent. The rivalry between House Blackwood and House Bracken became a miniature civil war inside the larger one. While dragons clashed in the skies and fleets battled at sea, these two ancient Riverlands houses waged their own brutal campaign on horseback and on foot, burning fields and storming keeps. The dance didn't create their hatred, but it amplified it, turning a generational feud into open warfare under the banner of opposing Targaryen claimants. Strategically, House Blackwood's support strengthened Team Black's hold over the Riverlands interior. Riverrun could not stand alone if surrounded by hostile bannermen, and the Blackwoods helped ensure that at least part of the Riverlands remained a reliable corridor for Northern and Vale support moving south. In a war where geography dictated survival, that mattered enormously. The cost to House Blackwood was severe but not annihilating. They lost men, burned crops, and endured the devastation that defined Riverlands warfare. Yet, unlike some families that were extinguished entirely during the dance, the Blackwoods survived. In many ways, the war hardened their reputation. They emerged, bloodied, but respected, their loyalty remembered by the eventual ruling line descended from Rhaenyra. House Blackwood's participation in Team Black reminds us that not every crucial ally was wealthy like the Velaryons, or politically central like the Arryns. Some were regional powers whose value came from consistency, aggression, and the willingness to fight relentlessly in the mud and ash of the Riverlands. The Blackwoods did not command dragons. They did not control fleets. But they held their ground, and in a war of attrition, that endurance was as valuable as any dragonfire. House Greyjoy of Pike ruled the Iron Islands during the Dance of the Dragons, commanding a culture and military force completely different from the mainland kingdoms. Their sigil shows a golden kraken on a black field, and their words, "We do not sow," perfectly summarize the Ironborn philosophy. They do not farm, they do not build lasting prosperity. They take. For centuries, the Ironborn had survived by raiding the western coasts of Westeros, and when the dance began, they saw opportunity rather than ideology. Lord Dalton Greyjoy, known as the Red Kraken, declared for Team Black. But unlike houses such as Stark or Arryn, his decision was not driven by oaths or questions of succession. Dalton supported Rhaenyra because she promised him freedom to raid the Westerlands. Team Green was backed heavily by House Lannister, and that alone made them an attractive target. By siding with Rhaenyra, Dalton secured political cover to unleash the Iron Fleet against Lannister lands without fear of royal reprisal if Team Black prevailed. What House Greyjoy brought to Team Black was maritime terror. While the Velaryons controlled Blackwater Bay and the eastern seas, the Ironborn struck the western coast. The Red Kraken launched aggressive raids across the Westerlands, sacking towns, burning ports, and seizing ships. The Lannisters, already stretched thin supporting Aegon II, were forced to divert resources to defend their own coastline. This pressure significantly weakened Team Green's western military capacity at a crucial stage of the war. Dalton Greyjoy himself was young, bold, and ruthless. He embodied the old Ironborn traditions of conquest and reaving, and his campaigns were conducted with little regard for political nuance. The Ironborn did not fight set-piece battles in the Riverlands or march on King's Landing. They destabilized an entire region through constant coastal warfare. In a conflict where supply lines and regional stability mattered enormously, this kind of disruption was strategically devastating. However, Greyjoy's loyalty to Team Black was transactional. Dalton was not fighting for Rhaenyra's claim out of principle. He was fighting for plunder. This distinction is important because it highlights the fragile nature of Team Black's coalition. Some houses were bound by blood or oath. Others, like the Greyjoys, were bound by opportunity. If circumstances had shifted, there is little doubt the Ironborn would have recalculated their position. The Iron Islands themselves remained largely untouched by dragonfire or invasion during the dance. Their geographic isolation protected them from retaliation while they projected violence outward. This allowed House Greyjoy to accumulate wealth and captives even as much of mainland Westeros burned. In that sense, the Ironborn arguably profited more cleanly from the war than almost any other major house involved. Dalton Greyjoy did not live long to enjoy the full fruits of his campaigns. He was eventually killed, not in glorious battle, but in a domestic betrayal, stabbed by one of his own salt wives, in a reminder that Ironborn culture is as dangerous internally as it is to outsiders. His death created instability in the Iron Islands just as the larger Targaryen conflict was winding down. House Greyjoy's role in Team Black's victory is often overlooked because it was indirect. They did not fight at Tumbleton. They did not stand at the Gullet. They did not march during the Hour of the Wolf. But by crippling Lannister's strength in the west and forcing Team Green to divide its focus, they materially weakened Aegon II's position. The dance was won as much by regional pressure and economic attrition as by dragon battles, and in that wider strategic picture, the Red Kraken's raids mattered. House Greyjoy reminds us that the Dance of the Dragons was not simply a war of succession between two Targaryen claimants. It was a continent-wide unraveling where ambitious lords exploited chaos for gain. Some fought for honor, some fought for legitimacy, and some, like Dalton Greyjoy, fought because war is simply the purest expression of who they already were. House Celtigar of Claw Isle is a Valyrian noble family, like the Targaryens and Velaryons, one of the ancient Dragonlord houses that survived the Doom and settled in Westeros. Their seat on Claw Isle sits in Blackwater Bay, not far from Driftmark, placing them geographically in the heart of what would become Team Black's naval territory. Their sigil features red crabs on white, a stark visual contrast to their Valyrian heritage, and their family has maintained close ties with both the Velaryons and the Targaryens since the early days of Aegon's kingdom. Lord Bartimos Celtigar was one of the initial signatories to Rhaenyra's faction, joining the Black Council that formed to coordinate Team Black's response to Aegon's coronation. His decision was natural, given the geographic and cultural proximity between Claw Isle and Driftmark, as well as the Celtigar tradition of loyalty to Valyrian bloodlines. The Celtigars viewed themselves as part of the Dragonlord diaspora community, and backing Rhaenyra against a Hightower-backed coup felt like defending the old Valyrian order against Andal political ambitions. What House Celtigar brought to Team Black was primarily naval expertise and geographic access. Claw Isle's position in Blackwater Bay made it a critical staging point for naval operations around King's Landing, and the Celtigar ships contributed to the Velaryon-dominated fleet that controlled the seas throughout most of the conflict. They weren't able to match the Velaryons in sheer naval scale, but their local knowledge and harbor access made them valuable partners in the maritime strategy that was so central to Team Black's overall plan. The Celtigars also brought political symbolism that mattered in the opening stages of the conflict. Having another Valyrian house publicly declare for Rhaenyra reinforced the narrative that Team Black represented the legitimate Targaryen bloodline and tradition. Team Green had the Hightowers and various Andal lords. Team Black had the Velaryons, the Celtigars, and the dragons that represented Valyrian power in its most literal form. Every Valyrian house that joined Rhaenyra's cause strengthened this narrative framing. Lord Bartimos's active role in the Black Council kept him involved in the political and strategic decision-making throughout the war. He was present for debates about military priorities, resource allocation, and diplomatic outreach to houses that hadn't yet committed. This insider position gave House Celtigar influence beyond what their military contribution alone would have provided, allowing them to shape decisions that affected the entire faction's conduct. The aftermath of the dance left House Celtigar in a relatively stable position compared to some of their allies. They hadn't overextended militarily, their island seat was defensible, and their early and consistent support for the winning faction protected them from the political reprisals that fell on families who had wavered or actively fought for Team Green. Claw Isle remained a functioning noble house with its Valyrian heritage intact, which was more than some families managed by the time the dance concluded. House Tarly of Hornhill is one of the most militarily respected houses in the Reach, known less for wealth or courtly influence, and more for discipline, battlefield competence, and relentless martial tradition. Their sigil bears a red huntsman on a green field, and their Valyrian steel sword, Heartsbane, symbolizes a legacy of warfare stretching back centuries. The Tarlys have always prided themselves on producing commanders rather than politicians, men trained to fight first and argue later. During the Dance of the Dragons, House Tarly declared for Team Black. This was a significant development because the Reach was largely divided, and its most powerful house, the Hightowers of Old Town, were the backbone of Team Green's cause. By siding with Rhaenyra, the Tarlys positioned themselves directly against one of the most influential regional powers in Westeros. That decision was not symbolic. It carried real military consequences. The Reach was one of the richest and most populous regions in the Seven Kingdoms, meaning whichever faction could secure substantial support there gained access to enormous manpower and food supplies. House Tarly's backing gave Team Black a foothold inside a region otherwise leaning green. Their forces contributed to the brutal campaigns that erupted across the Reach, including the chaotic series of engagements that culminated in the First and Second Battles of Tumbleton, some of the bloodiest and most destructive clashes of the entire war. Unlike houses motivated purely by oath or personal rivalry, the Tarly alignment appears rooted in a combination of loyalty to the crown, as Viserys had defined it, and calculation about long-term stability. The Tarlys were not naive. They understood that the war would not be decided solely in King's Landing, but across the fields and castles of the south. Supporting Rhaenyra meant committing to a campaign that would likely devastate the Reach itself, but it also meant opposing what many viewed as a Hightower-driven power consolidation. Militarily, House Tarly's reputation for strict command structure and disciplined troops mattered enormously in a war increasingly defined by chaos. As dragons began to die and central authority fractured, battlefield cohesion became more important than ever. Reach armies fractured along factional lines, and the fighting in that region often turned savage and unpredictable. The presence of experienced commanders from houses like Tarly helped prevent Team Black's southern efforts from collapsing entirely under internal confusion. The devastation in the Reach rivaled that of the Riverlands. By the war's end, crops were burned, towns sacked, and entire levies wiped out in dragonfire or ambush. The Tarly lands did not escape this destruction simply because they had chosen the ultimately victorious faction. Victory in a civil war does not spare you from the physical consequences of fighting it on your own soil. House Tarly survived the dance, but like many Black-aligned houses in contested regions, they emerged hardened and diminished. Their loyalty positioned them well politically once Rhaenyra's line continued through Aegon III, yet the material damage to the Reach and the deepened internal rivalries between Reach houses would shape southern politics for years afterward. House Tarly's role in Team Black's coalition illustrates something important about the dance. The war was not cleanly divided by region. Even in areas dominated by Green influence, there were houses willing to resist, either out of conviction, rivalry, or long-term calculation. The Tarlys stood as a reminder that legitimacy arguments resonated beyond the North and the Vale. Even in the fertile heart of the Reach, there were lords willing to challenge Hightower dominance and stake their future on Rhaenyra's claim. They did not command dragons. They did not dominate the seas, but they brought something just as essential to Team Black's cause: disciplined southern steel in a region that might otherwise have fallen entirely under Green control.